So, okay guys, so let's get started. We have a lot to cover through today for billing training. So I should introduce, this is the session that you're attending today, hopefully, that you meant to. It's the number 4 session, and the topic is billing and reporting for the Canadian version. And typically what I try to do in these sessions to get started with is I try to walk you through what I would normally walk a brand new clinic through, someone who's brand new to the software and just trying to learn all the ins and outs and possibilities. And then the topic today, of course, is billing and reporting. So we'll get started. So hopefully, just to make sure everybody can actually see my screen, let me just make sure that you're actually able to see what's happening there. So everybody should see in a moment or two a scheduler on your screen. And I am moving my mouse back and forth, left and right, across some appointments in the screen. If you are unable to see that, just put a little chat in your chat box there, and I'll make sure I address it directly with you. But otherwise, everybody should be seeing that on the screen, and hopefully you can hear me as well on the phone. So we're starting in the scheduler today for no other reason, just to kind of reiterate how you get to the point that you have some billing to look at in a billing training session. So typically this entails all of the previous sessions up until now, right? Session 1 was all about setup of the software. How do we set up a patient? How do we make sure that patient is attached to an insurance company or a third party through their billing rules? How do we make sure that the payer that they're attached to has also been set up to throw the correct type of invoice? So a lot of this next part was actually done in session number 1, but very quickly, when you're looking at your payers or setting up your third-party payers on your listing, one of the most important parts of your setup is happening at the bottom right-hand side of the payer screen when you double-click on them. So telling the system what type of insurance company they are, what kind of insurance company this is to you, and then what type of invoice we want the system to produce. So that means when we bill this particular payer, what is it that we want to send them? Do we want to send them a paper-looking invoice? Do we want to send them an electronic billable file? And then your selections are usually somewhere on this list. Now, in Canada, in general, there's tons of different options. And then within your province, there's more options from there. So in general, in Canada, if you're billing an extended healthcare insurance company and they're part of the TELUS portal, then TELUS Health Invoice selection here is the type of invoice that would submit directly through to the TELUS portal from Practice Perfect. In theory, you would no longer have to log into the TELUS portal manually with a username and password and fill out the information on the patient. This would send those details to them. So that would be selected on a payer that's part of the TELUS portal. In Ontario, for motor vehicle claims, you might be submitting directly through what's called HCI for all your motor vehicle claims. You might be producing paper, just generic, normal, standard, everyday invoices. If you're in BC, you might be selecting a different option on your list. There might be OHIP on your list, BC Teleplan. So the choice that you make against your payer tells the system what type of invoice it should be looking at or producing when it's time to bill that payer. And then from that choice, you have settings that you usually have to enable. So at the bottom of your settings drop down for the Canadian versions, you have specific settings if you're on Ontario billing motor vehicle claims, OHIP claims, workers' comp claims. For BC, you have your ICBC, MSP, and WCB claims. For all Canada, if you're submitting through the TELUS portal type insurance, you have your TELUS setup information. So for those of you who are attending today who maybe didn't attend session number 1 or not quite sure what settings you're supposed to enable where in the system, make sure you put your email in the chat box or send me an email after the fact today, and I will make sure that you have some written instructions, and I'll send you a video as to what you need to specifically do in those areas to tell the system detail information like what's your username and password and convert your fees and all that kind of good stuff. Okay, so that part was covered in session number 1, but those setup items are very important when it comes to billing because the system is just going to respond to the setup. But for billing purposes, a lot of times we'll bill from the payer listing here. We'll bill a bunch of different insurance companies at the same time. So we reference that as bulk billing. You want to bill a few different insurance companies, a few different patients, all at the same time. Now, my particular database is a play around with database, so I have a ton of different payers in here. I have a ridiculous number. I have 700 payers. So 700 payers would be a little bit tricky to deal with, right? If I had to go through and flag everything that I wanted to manually in the list, I'd be all day flag, 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 go down, flag, flag, flag. So instead of having to do that manually, up on your function bar, there is a 2 red flag with a question mark icon, and that's to help identify certain things in the system, so certain payers by a criteria. So that tells the system to flag for you. And a lot of times when you're billing in bulk, you want to bill by a criteria. You want to say something like, I would like to bill all of my TELUS payers right now, or I would like to bill all of my HCI payers, or all of my motor vehicle payers right now. Or you might do it by the kind of payer. I would like to bill all my workers' comp payers right now. I would like to bill all my other type payers right now. So you can tell the system to find insurance companies or payers by these criteria, and then it would go through and put a little flag next to them. Okay, so the first step to identify is flagging. You either manually flag, tell the system which names you want to work with, or tell the system to find certain insurance companies by a criteria. And then from there, after a flag, it's always a function that you choose on your function bar. So the next step would be to produce invoices. For the payers that are flagged on the left, we would like to produce some billing, produce some invoices for those payers. So remember, this simulation is called bulk billing. I'm going to take you to single billing after this. And that's when you want to bill one patient, one service right from the scheduler. So right now what we're talking about is multiple patients. So if I had 2 or 3 insurance companies or so flagged, the next step would be produce invoices. And the system is now asking me to make some selections. It's saying, great, I know who you want to work with on the left. Those are the ones that are flagged. I know you want to produce invoices for services. And now it's saying, for what date range would you like to produce these services for? So the first selection is, I don't really care about the date range. As long as my services have not already been invoiced or billed, let's bill them now. Let's invoice them now. And that's the default. Other than that, your choice would be, I prefer to just bill for services as long as the date was last month, or I prefer to bill for services for a date range that you actually manually enter. So if you were doing a month end, let's say, and this was February the 3rd, you might say, I'm only interested in billing from January 1st to January 31st. Okay. From there, the next selection is, what is the date that you would like your invoice to be? It will always assume today's date, but you could backdate, you could forward date. And then from there, your selections are usually, do you want to bill all of your locations at the same time if you have multiple locations, or you might be picking and choosing particular ones. Okay. From there, it's an okay to move forward. So if the system does find something to bill, then you will get this screen. And your choices at the bottom reflect the type of invoice that you're submitting. So if you see a send button at the bottom left, it'll only show up on payers where you can submit something electronically. The style of invoice that we've chosen is something that we can submit electronically. Otherwise, that would say print it and post it. Your other option would be send it via email, do a post only to the screen, and then a preview. So we would typically advise the best practice is always to do a little preview first before you submit something. Just have a look at it, make sure it's got everything in there that you need. A lot of times when you're submitting electronically, what the system is doing is providing a little scrub on the billing. It's trying to produce some comments or some heads up as to what possibly might be missing on your file. So typically when you get any kind of preview like this for TELUS or HCI or ICBC MSP, it's going to give you comments if it thinks something is invalid or missing. So any comments in theory would be bad. The only comment I would say that's good is if the comment actually says ready for submission. Okay, otherwise it's trying to identify you might be missing something, have another double look. So for TELUS submissions specifically, if it says invalid level key or field missing, there's usually a little note just below the patient's name. I'm just going to highlight that in yellow for you. And it would identify things that TELUS requires but that are missing in the system. And it might say something like the patient is missing their address, their birthday, your facility information is incorrect, you haven't got your username or your password entered in yet. So a lot of times those things will come from your setup area, or those things probably have to do with the profile on the patient, name, address, phone number, birthday, policy, claim number. Okay, so if those previews look perfect to you, there's no comment or the comment says ready for submission, you would probably close your preview, and at that point you would hit the send button. You would try to transmit over to TELUS. There's nothing stopping you from trying to hit the send button at the moment, even though there's comments in our preview, but we're pretty much guaranteeing you're going to get a rejection right away. That's not going to go through because we know we're already missing some information. Okay, so I'm going to cancel out of that one. So the same kind of concept, if we had a motor vehicle insurance company, let's say for our Ontario regions, when you go to bill or invoice that particular payer, same kind of concept, it would be something electronic. So before you send it directly to them, you would want to do a preview, and the preview looks almost identical. Same for ICBC, MSP, anything in BC that you're billing electronically, same type of concept. The preview would tell you if there's anything wrong with the file first. You would stop the process, go back and fix that patient, fix whatever it says is missing, do this again, and then eventually hit that send button. Okay, so it's called bulk billing when you bill a few different insurance companies, many different insurance companies off the same screen. They will oftentimes have lots of patients, lots of dates of service all connected at the same file. You can also achieve the same thing through the scheduler. If you're on a single patient in the scheduler, you could also bill directly through the scheduler. It's the same little icon, same process, but when you do it through the scheduler, you're only working on this one patient. Should just keep that in mind. You're not really billing in bulk for many patients. If you stay on the same patient name and say, let's invoice, you're just billing that one patient. Another way to do that would be to go to the patient's activities by service, right, their history in the background, flag some services in here. Once you flag, you always pick an option off the function bar. And if we say we want to invoice from here, same kind of thing, we're going to end up with the exact same submission. We're just submitting for this one patient. Okay, so it all just depends on how you want to do it. If you tend to hold off until the end of the month and you bill many patients, many services all at the same time, the fastest way tends to be through the payer listing. A lot of times for TELUS, you want to get those submissions out to TELUS the same day, almost immediately when the patient shows up for their appointment. So a lot of times you're billing directly from the scheduler as well. Okay. Same concept for patient billing, and I'm referring to the charges that are going directly to the patient's responsibility. So if you're the type of clinic that holds off, you're charging private paying patients throughout the month and people don't want their bill to the end of the month or on the 15th and the 30th or something, you're kind of holding on to these charges until some point that you want to bill them in bulk. You do the same thing, but you start with clients. So you start with your active list of clients or all clients in your clinic location. From here, it would be exactly the same steps. You would manually flag on the list, or you might use the 2 red flags, flag by a criteria, flag all your private patients, flag all your copay patients that you want to bill at the same time. But once you flag, the process is exactly the same from there. What do you want to do to those flagged clients? You want to produce invoices for them. You want to bill them. What are the dates of service? What are your locations? And then from there, you'll usually get paper invoices. You can also email these to your clients if they have email address information or your settings are enabled for email. But typically these patients don't really get an electronic submission per se. They get kind of a standard, generic, what we call everyday invoice that would be going to patients, but you're doing them in bulk at this point. You're doing many patients, many services all at the end of the month. Okay. So typically from here, instead of a send button, unless everybody had email addresses, you would post print it. Everybody gets a piece of paper. You would post email it. Everybody gets an email instead. Or post only is when you only want this to be official but happen on screen only. Okay, so that would be called bulk billing for patient responsibility. So whether we are billing patients or whether we're billing third-party insurances, all of those charges are called unbilled until the point that you bill them. So if we were to look at, I'm just going to go to Mr. Test private pay here. If we go to his activities by service, I just want to point out that terminology. So charging your patients, how the numbers appear in a charge column is because the little white hand was used to record the services rendered to the client. So that's how people get charged. So in theory, if you have an appointment and the patient shows up, everybody gets charged. How the numbers show up in the billed column, and billed is synonymous with invoiced in our system. So invoicing is billing, billing is invoicing. And how the numbers show up in the billed column is only if you've assigned an official invoice number to those charges. You've officially sent it to the payer, you've officially sent it to the patient, you've officially printed a piece of paper with an invoice number. And that's done with the invoice icon off the function bar. Okay, and then the only way, of course, it goes into the paid column, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is if we've recorded a payment against it, and that's done with the little pile of money icon. Okay, so it's kind of a three-step process. We charge the patient, they might pay it to get their bill or invoice, or we might invoice it to get the payment. But until those things show up in the billed column, we reference those as unbilled or uninvoiced. And there's a report to show you those as well. So let's take a quick loop back to session number 2 for reporting purposes. How you get to the point that you have all these things to bill and pay in the future is because we've set the patients up a certain way, we've booked an appointment, we've gone through the 1, 2, 3, 4 step on a patient every day. They showed up, we charged them, we tried to take their money, we tried to give them an invoice if that was possible, and then we check the first report called your daily reconciliation. Have we missed anything? Is there any appointment in the scheduler that wasn't charged? Then we check all those charges with the revenue report. That's a detailed reporting of just the little white hands that were charged. Oftentimes, we're looking to make sure the price was right, the unit was right. We didn't charge 2 assessments on the same day for the same patient. It's going to the right entity if they have insurance. Did the patient get charged instead of the insurance company, vice versa? So you're verifying all the charges so that you have good things to bill. And then from there, if you haven't billed them or paid them already, they're going to be on the unbilled services report in your financial section. So that's the report that tells you or gives you a list of all the services at any time that are not yet billed. So sometimes clinics check that report before they do any billing. They say, let's see what there is to see in unbilled services, and I want to check it all before I do my billing. And then we would advise always run that report after you think you just billed. So if you think you just billed everybody that there was to bill, you think you've done your whole bill run at the end of the month, then you would run the unbilled services report and see if the system has something to show you. There should be no surprises on the unbilled report. You would be like, what? I thought I just billed everybody. Why is my test copay person still here? Oh yes, I forgot. I'm holding on to them. They've got one more service and then I'm going to send out the bill. Okay. So once we bill items, in the system, once we officially get them on invoices, they move from the unbilled services report up to accounts receivables by invoice. So accounts receivables by invoice are all the services that are billed but not yet paid. And you can filter a ton of different things in this report. You can say, just show me client stuff, just show me payer stuff, just show me the stuff that's over 60 days old. So this is where the system is aging the invoice. So from the date of the invoice, the clock starts ticking and items are showing up either in 30, 60, 90 days. You're trying to collect, get payment from all the items technically that are on this list. This is usually what you use for collections. Okay, and in your accounts receivables report, you can use your contact log that we learned earlier in our training sessions. If you record little messages on your patients and you categorize those little messages by a category maybe called collections or whatever you want to call that category, but the little phone icon is what you would use to record a contact log message. You can include those messages on this report. You can say, show me as of right now all of my accounts receivables that are 60 days and over, and just show me the notes that have a collection category. And then the system will show you all those notes as well. Okay, so from that report, your accounts receivables by invoice, as we start posting some payments in a moment, the numbers are going to move from that report down to payment journal. So in theory, you want everything listed against your payment journal as quickly as humanly possible. So sometimes we could ask the question, what is the difference between a payment journal and a payment application report? So the answer would be the payment journal is just simply recording the overall payment. So if a patient today gives me a $100 check, that would show up on my payment journal as a one payment $100 check. The application report would show that $100 in details where the 100 was applied. So it would say $20 was applied to these 5 dates of service, or $80 of the $100 was applied to these dates of service, and the other 20 is unapplied. It's listed as a credit not applied to any service. So I would say the application report is a little bit more detailed than the payment journal, but the payment journal shows the whole total of your payment. That's what the difference is. Okay. Okay, so now let's start talking about some payments and how we start recording payments in the system. So a couple of different ways. I'm just going to stay on the screen that we're already on. So I'm on my test private pay patient at the top of the screen. I'm on his activities by service. I'm looking at all of his activities that have happened in the past, and then we're going to make some payments off this screen. Now, this particular patient, of course, is a self-paying patient. He has no insurance, so there's really only one possible payer, right, the patient. So nice and easy, I can either flag or identify to the system which of the payments, which of the lines I would like to pay. So in my example here, for whatever reason, I'm saying he doesn't want to pay the first line there on the 22nd. He wants to pay this service and this service. So if you flag first before you make your payment second, then the system will only think that you're going to pay whatever's flagged. Let's start that again. If we don't flag anything, and then we say we would like to make a payment, the system will just have to assume you're probably paying for everything that the patient is outstanding. From there, you can always be specific. But if you start with a specific flag first, then the system will just kind of ignore everything else and just focus on what you flagged. Okay, so this particular screen is called a multi-payment screen. This comes up, you can force this to come up, by the way, with a setting if you like this screen all the time. But this normally comes up or only comes up when you have multiple things to pay. So I have one patient and then I have multiple lines of service that I want to pay. If I was looking at this patient in the scheduler, he's my green appointment, and I decide I want to make a payment from here, it's a condensed version of that payment screen. The system just assumes you want to pay everything the patient owes. It doesn't show you line by line. It just shows you a condensed version. So when you're looking at more detail, if you're looking at all the services for that patient and flagging a few of them before you get started, you'll typically always get what's called the multiple payment screen. So it just means you can have more options, you can be very specific as to where the payment goes. You still start at the top of the screen. You still confirm a date of payment, the method of which you want to record the payment coming in, and the system will tend to assume they're going to pay what they owe, and we all know that's not always the case. So the most important amount here is the actual amount they are paying you. What's the actual check they're giving you? The actual amount. Description is no rules in here. A lot of people put the EFT transfer number or the check number in here as a reference, but you don't have to use that area if you don't want to. But again, the most important part I will describe as the apply amount, the amount of the payment. So that total has to equal the total of this column called your apply total. So it's basically saying how much are you getting paid and where do you want to put that payment. So the system will show you line by line by line your options. So the first line is saying we billed out $100 on this day, and you would answer how much do you want to apply there. We billed out this much on this day, how much do you want to apply there, and so on and so forth all the way down. So this little total has to eventually equal the total of your payment. And you just move the numbers where you need the numbers to be. So in my example, I'm going to pretend they billed us 100, they paid us 50, they billed us 50, we paid the 50, and then they billed us 200 and we're going to pay 150 there. So my total all the way down is 250. Now that leaves me a balance on two of my lines. So on the first line, I'm pretending we billed out 100, but they only paid 50. Maybe there's something we weren't aware of. Maybe there's a situation, if this was a third-party payer, maybe there's a deductible we didn't know about, maybe there's a copay we didn't know about, but the balance has been left over. Now, of course, I did this on my self-pay patient where there's nowhere else to go, but if there was a balance left over, you would be transferring that balance onto likely another payer or back to the patient. So if it was a motor vehicle situation, a lot of times you're going to bill out an amount to the extended. If they don't pay the whole thing, you're going to move the amount on to the motor vehicle. Or you bill out to the extended, they don't pay the whole thing, we move the amount back on to the patient. Another option is called a write-off or discount. You can say, well, I billed them the wrong amount. I should have actually billed them 50 in the first place, so I'm going to write off the 50. The system will make you choose a write-off method above if you're going to have any write-offs or discounts. And remember, you can control that drop-down list in your settings for housekeeping. Okay. So that would be how we record a patient payment. I kind of simulated a third-party payment in there as well. So if we do that again on my extended healthcare patient here, I'm going to go into their activities by service, and then let's flag a few lines in here and pretend like we're going to make a payment. So in this scenario, I have a patient where everything apparently was billed to the third party. We're going to pretend that they paid a portion of that and there's a balance left over. Now is when I can see all my options to transfer the balance. So likely it would move on to the secondary, or it would move on to the patient, or we would write it off. Okay, so when I do it this way, I'm only doing it for one patient. This would be a scenario, I've got a single payment for this one patient, or I want to post my payment patient by patient by patient. Another option to do this faster sometimes is to do it by the payer screen, almost like bulk billing. You can bulk pay. So you would start the same way. You would go to the insurance company that's giving you the large check, maybe that's paying for 40 people at the same time. And when you flag that payer, you would likely go to activities by invoice. You would have a look at all the invoices that you've sent them that are still outstanding. That is likely what they're paying. I don't have any invoices likely, so I'm going to fake it a little bit. I'm going to go to activities by service, but this is where I might see tons of different patients and invoices that are still outstanding. And you would start the same way, start flagging things on that list. And when you flag multiple patients, multiple dates of service, and then go to make the payment, you also get the multiple payment screen. This screen is just slightly different than when you're paying on a patient screen. You actually get the number of payers that a patient has on this screen. The process is still the same. You still choose a method, you still enter the amount, whatever it is they don't pay moves on to a write-off or a balance transfer onto the next payer. But in this screen, it'll remind you how many payers this patient has. So if they have 2, it's likely you can move it on to the second payer. If they only have 1, you're on the only payer they have. Your only other option then is probably move on to the patient. Okay, but you could post a big $10,000 check paying 35 people at the same time this way. Okay, so that's how your numbers are going to move again on your report. Once you start taking invoices or charges off the screen that are either billed or unbilled and start paying them, they move to the payment journal. Okay. Okay, so the next thing we're going to show you is I'm actually going to go to the client listing here and talk about the difference between invoices and statements for those that are unclear. And it is a little confusing, I will say, in our system what we define as a statement versus an invoice. Those are not the same things in our system, but I know that out in the accounting world, sometimes invoice means statement. So when you're looking at a list of clients, when you start flagging clients off the list, statements, whoops, I clicked too far there. Statements are little icons on your desktop version of the software. So extra little icons appearing on your function bar. So when you have patients flagged, you have 2 different possibilities up here for statements. You have account statements and then you have client statements. So a statement in our system is just sort of like running a report. It doesn't move one number from any column to another column. It doesn't call it billed. It doesn't call it unbilled when you run statements. Statements is more so just like running a report. So if I take my private pay patient here as an example, and I go to his activities by service in here, and I expand some of these services, we might notice he has multiple invoices, right? He has this generic invoice down here on the 15th, and then this service was invoiced on this invoice. And throughout the year, throughout the couple of months that we're seeing this patient, he might have several different invoices. Another way to see that is to go to the screen activities by invoice. It'll show all the invoices in here. So I could, if a patient asks for history, transactions that have happened for the past 3 months, I could reprint all of the individual invoices they have, or I could run a statement. I could say, let's just run a statement for this patient from January 1st to whatever, January 1st to December 31st, and let's show all the transactions that have happened. Of course, I have nothing on this patient. Let me just switch my date ranges there. And then it's just like a report. It's saying, here's all the things that have happened throughout that month, but it's not officially calling them billed or unbilled or paid or unpaid. It's showing the payments. It's showing the invoice numbers and whatnot. It's just not actually producing something as billed, if that makes sense. It's just like running a report in our system, but it's nice that you can have everything all in one report. So instead of having to reproduce 3 different invoices, let's say for this patient for the past month, I could just run him a statement for the month. The statements do show aging, and you do have lots of options when you're running statements. All these little tick boxes are options to include or exclude things, and you can put a little note on your individual statement as well. You can actually put a little note on an individual invoice for a patient as well, if you want, as you go. And when you run statements, you can actually have the system enter a comment in your contact log. So if you tick the little box that says, let's enable a little statement in our contact log, you can decide what category. You control all those categories up in housekeeping. And I just happen to have one that says statements that are sent, and then I can put a little message. I sent this statement for this patient on January, the blah, blah, blah. And then when I print out this statement for my patient, it would record a message in their contact log, recording when I sent the statement. Okay. So I am getting some questions sometimes about, I'm getting a couple questions actually in the background for the same thing. Is there any way to produce separate receipts without making two separate payments in the system? Like if they're going to have a physio service and maybe a product that they purchase. In theory, no. You're going to have to do that as two separate payments in the system, unfortunately. There's a couple of different options. You can get a little bit creative with that, but in theory, you would have to do it in two separate steps. So if you had a private patient like this, I'll go to their history, and we've recorded, this as a transaction on the 22nd, and this as a transaction on the 20th. It's the order that you do this that would affect your receipt or your invoice. So in theory, if we look to the right-hand side, those services on our screen at the moment are called unbilled and they're called unpaid. So I could, in theory, flag all those three services. I could make one big payment for those services. I could say, let's just pay them at $350, and I could tell the system not to produce an invoice. So I'm not going to tick any of these boxes up here that say, let's produce an invoice and a receipt for those. And then if I loop around later and I flag one of those services and say, let's produce an invoice for that one, and then flag the other two and say, let's produce an invoice for that one, you could, in theory, get two separate invoices that way by making one payment. It's the order that you do it. But if you have your services, you've already paid and invoiced them, and then you want to produce two separate receipts for that, I don't believe that there would be a way to do that. You could run a statement for that probably, but you couldn't run two separate invoices out of one, if that helps answer your question. Okay. So the reports that I showed you today, we would also reference those as monthly reports. We would advise you, if you're looking for a report at the end of the month, to do a recap and see if we've missed anything for the whole month of January, we would still say the daily reconciliation is a great report to see those numbers. You just run that report instead for the whole month instead of a single day. A great way to make sure we haven't missed anything. We haven't backdated an appointment and forgot to charge them or something in that report. We do still think your revenue report is a great report at the end of the month. You just change your date range for that as well. And sometimes you change your criteria. Instead of looking at all the detail and summary that you've been looking at probably every day or every week, you would maybe say, I just want a summary. I just want to recap all the services that I've entered, all the things we've sold, instead of the detail. But then again, you could still run the detail. It just depends on what you're looking for. But that report is still a great report to run. The three other reports we talked about today in finances, those are also great reports to run at the end of the month. Your unbilled services, that is a good thing to know. Show me all the unbilled items I still have at the end of the month. In theory, we want to get that all cleaned up. Show me all the invoices that are outstanding. How's my aging looking? How's my collections looking? That's a great report to know at the end of the month. And then your payment journal, payment application as well, great reports at the end of the month. We do have another one called your general ledger posting report. That is usually a report that an accountant, or this is more of a high-level report that your financial system sometimes needs. So I'm just going to run this report. Probably don't have great information in here, but this is an example. These are all my ledgers on the left-hand side, and it's not showing me all my individual transactions. That's what all your revenue report, accounts receivable, unbilled, that's the reports that are showing you those details. This is just kind of showing you your debits and credits, your balance at the end of the month. So usually you need these numbers for a balance sheet or an income statement. Your accountant, your financial advisor usually wants something like this. So your accounts receivable would be all those invoices that are not yet paid. So throughout the month, you're paying things, you're invoicing things, your debits, your credits are changing, but at the end of the month, that's your number. That's your total amount of accounts receivables. Your bank would be all your real payments, cash, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, all the payments that are affecting your bank account would show up as that number. They're increasing, decreasing potentially throughout the month. So your balance is what you need to know at the end of the month. Sales tax payable, all your treatment revenue, all the items you've sold, your PT revenue as opposed to your speech revenue. Those are the totals of your revenue. Those are all your white hands, your charges for services and goods sold. And then your work in progress, that would be all the services charged that are not yet billed. Those are your unbilled. Okay, and when you run reports, a lot of times these little two options here, and I'll point them out, I'm just going to highlight them on your screen. You just have to be aware of what those mean, and you want to be consistent. They give you two very different numbers. We get a lot of emails and questions at the end of the month sometimes about why my reports don't match. If I run this report and that report, why aren't the numbers matching? So a lot of our reports have two different ways to show you numbers. One is called show everything taking place within this period of time. And what that means is as long as the date of service was between those date ranges, show up on this report. So date of service is what appears in the background as the actual date we saw the patient, basically. That's what show everything taking place means. The other option on here, called show everything I entered during this period of time, means as long as my fingers touch the keyboard between these dates, ignore the date of the service on the left and just go by the date my fingers touch the keyboard. So if I entered something on January the 15th, but I backdated it to December the 15th, if I use this option on my report for January, it would show up in January because I entered it in January. But if I use the other option, show everything taking place, it would not show up on this report because my actual date taking place is December. Okay. Just a heads up on that. Another thing to keep a heads up on is a lot of our reports. Let me look at Daily Rec. When we're looking at reports and we're showing you new referrals or new incidents for a client, we have 3 ways to show you that information as well. You're going to get 3 different numbers based on those 3 options. The default option is called a contact date. And that's the date your fingers touch the keyboard to enter the patient in the system. So if you say, show me all the patients for the month of January, all the new patients that have entered for the month of January by contact date, then that's the date you entered them. As long as you physically entered them in the system in the month of January, they would show up on that report. If you say, show me all my new patients for the month of January by referral date, then that's a specific date that you're entering in the patient profile. If there isn't a date in that field that's in January, they wouldn't show up on this report. Same for assessment date. So just know that there's 3 different ways for you to report on new clients in the system. And I'll show you where those are coming from. When I go into a client profile and I'm setting up a patient, this is the referral date field. So if you ask your report to show items by this particular field, if your client doesn't have something entered in that field or that field doesn't meet the criteria you've asked for, they're not going to show up on the report. The other field comes from the statistics tab on a patient, and it's the assessment date. That's your second option. The other date also comes from this field, from this tab, but it is generated by your fingers and the keyboard. This is the date of contact. That's the date you physically entered them into the system. The system kind of just records that for you based on the date and time of your computer. Now you can change that date manually if you come into this field into this tab, statistics, and manually click on that little calendar, you could physically change the date there as well if you needed to. Okay. Okay, guys, so I'm going to open up the phones now for the last couple of minutes and just see if there are any other questions I missed or questions that you have for me. So feel free to shout out any questions you have along the way. And other than that, if you guys would like, Michelle has your email address, I believe, for everybody who signed up for the session today. I can ask Michelle to send out a sample of these reports here if you would like, if you find that helpful. We do have a little sheet that talks about the name of the report and then what that report would show you, and then we actually have a sample as well. Okay. Okay, guys, is there any other questions before we end our session today?
Heather, I have a question about the notes that we can put on invoices. I sent it via the chat, but maybe you didn't get it.
Oh, sorry, I must have missed it.
Oh, no, that's okay. Is there a way of creating a drop-down list of escalating notes for invoices? For example, like our first invoice, hey, you know, this is now due. It's now 60 days overdue. Can you please pay it? You know, we're going to send it to a collection agency soon, and have a drop-down list of those notes, similar to the cancellation drop-down list notes that you recently created for us.
Right. So the short answer is probably no, not yet. There isn't an option like there is for the cancellation where you can create those messages and then use them in a drop-down. But when you're in a statement, so I'm just going to go into the little pink icon, and I'm going to use the second tab here for contact log. Can you see that there's already kind of words there, hello to? Can you see those words? So those are words that, it's not a drop down per se, but it'll remember what you wrote last time on this patient, but unfortunately there's no drop down.
So we could see that we've done like kind of our third kind of request for an invoice, and now we're on to whatever our fourth wording is.
Yeah, I don't know that this would be, I wouldn't suggest you rely on this because it's just what you wrote last time, right? The best place to go would actually be the little phone icon. And then you might search by category, right? You would say, okay, show me all my statements I send, and then read your categories. I've sent number 1, number 2, number 3 collection. That would be the better way to do it. But when you're doing statements, it would at least remember that little last comment, if that helps.
That patient specific, that's the last comment I wrote, or does that cross over from another?
You know what? To be honest, I haven't actually tested that. I'm making the assumption that it's just on this patient, but I'm actually not sure. I'd have to try that out.
Okay.
Are there any other questions I can help you guys with today?
Would that be something that development could look at, maybe?
Definitely.
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, guys. So if there's no other questions, or if you do think about some questions later, you forgot to ask me, or you just thought about this after the fact, just remember when you're logged into Practice Perfect, if you go to the Help menu at the top of the screen, if you go to the first section, About, that's how you get your contact information there. There's a link to the Learning Center, all our little videos. There's a link to the email address for support. If you just shoot the email off to them, or if you replace support with my name's Heather, it'll come directly to me, and then we can certainly make sure that your questions are addressed. Okay. Thanks for attending, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye.